Girivardhari. Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Yamunatira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jayo Vishnupad Paramhamsa Paramahansa To Tadasata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Samveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so we're on Canto 3, Chapter 1, Text 25, according to The Thing. The WhatsApp thing. Savasudevanucharam prashantam Savasudevanucharam prashantam Brihaspate praktanayam pratitam Brihaspate praktanayam pratitam Alingya gardhama pranayena bhadram Alingya gardham pranayena bhadram Svanam aprichhada bhagavat prajanyam Svanam aprichhada bhagavat prajanam Savasudevanucharam prasantam Brihaspate Tranayam pratitam Alingyagadhama pranayena bhadram Svanam aprichhad bhagavat prajanam Savasudevanucharam prashantam Brihaspate praktanayam pratitam Alingyagadhama pranayena bhadram Svanam aprichad bhagavat prajanam Savasudevanucharam prasantam Prapate praktanayam pratitam Alingyagadham pranayena bhadram Svanam aprichad bhagavat prajanam Savasudevanucharam prashantam Brihaspate praktanayam pratitam Alingyagadham pranayena bhadram Svanam apritchad bhagavat prajanam. Savasudevanucharam prashantam. Brihaspate praktanayam pratitam. Alingya gardham pranayena bhadram. Svanam apritchad bhagavat prajanam. Saha he Vidura. Vasudeva, Lord Krishna. Anucharam, constant companion. Prashantam, very sober and gentle. Brihaspatehe, of Brihaspati, the learned spiritual master of the demigods. Prak, formerly. Tanayam, son or disciple. Pratitam, acknowledged. Alingya, embracing. Garham, very feelingly. Pranayena, in love. Bhadram, auspicious. Svanam, his own. Apritchat, asked. Bhagavat, of the personality of Godhead. Prajanam, family. So the translation reads, then due to his great love and feeling, Vidura embraced him, Uddhava, who was a constant companion of Lord Krishna and formerly a great student of Brihaspati. Vidura then asked him for news of the family of Lord Krishna, the personality of Godhead. So I say, and you please repeat. Then, due to his great love and feeling, Vidura embraced him, Uddhava, who was a constant companion, of Lord Krishna, and formerly a great student, of Brihaspati. Vidura then asked him for news of the family of Lord Krishna, the personality of Godhead. All right, so we have purport here. Vidura was older than Uddhava, like a father. And therefore, when the two met, Uddhava bowed down to Vidura, and Vidura embraced him because Uddhava was younger, like a son. Vidura's brother, Pandu, was Lord Krishna's uncle, and Uddhava was a cousin to Lord Krishna. According to social custom, therefore, Vidura was to be respected by Uddhava on the level of his father. Uddhava was a great scholar in logic, and he was known to be a son or disciple of Brihaspati, the greatly learned priest and spiritual master of the demigods. Vidura asked Uddhava about the welfare of his relatives, although he already knew they were no longer in the world. This inquiry appears to be very queer, but Sri Jiva Goswami states that the news was shocking to Vidura, who therefore inquired again due to great curiosity. Thus his inquiry was psychological and not practical. Savasudevanucharam prashantam brihaspate praktanayam pratitam alingyagandham pranayena bhadram Svanam aprachadam bhagavat prajanam. Then, due to his great love and feeling, Vidura embraced him, Uddhava, who was a constant companion of Lord Krishna, and formerly a great student of Brihaspati's. Vidura then asked him for news of the family of Lord Krishna, the personality of Godhead. Of course, this asking about the family of Lord Krishna is not exactly a rhetorical question, but a question that both of them knew the answer to. But what I can gather from this is that Vidura was hoping that maybe Uddhava would shed some light on why Krishna had removed his entire dynasty, the Yadus, from the earth. We find out about this in Bhagavatam that Lord Krishna knew that his pastimes were drawing to a close. So, in understanding his pastimes were drawing to a close, he thought about his dynasty, the Yadus. And Krishna's opinion was that the Yadus were very powerful. And some of them were not so controlled. And if they were left on the earth after Krishna himself departed, they might create some mischief on the earth. And plus, Krishna was eager to have them back, in the spiritual world. So the idea was to wind up the family, the entire Yadu family. Just to get a kind of timeline here, I'm trying to keep this all sort of, hopefully, sequential. The Bhagavatam itself, as you know, is not chronological. It kind of jumps forward and backwards, but it's thematic. The Bhagavatam follows certain themes, but it kind of jumps back and forth. We talked about this back in the first canto, and now we're back again to the same point. And we're going to hear a little bit more about it in the next chapter, in the second chapter of the third canto, about how Uddhava will not give direct instruction about Krishna to Vidura. Rather, he will ask that Vidura approach Maitreya. And again, as we're learning here, the reason for that is that Vidura is much older than Uddhava. Uddhava is around the same age as Krishna, a youngish 125. And Vidura was one of the older folks. So Vidura is, of course, a sibling of the Maharaja Shantanu, he had a son, and that son was Devarata. And of course, Devarata would have become king, but Shantanu fell in love with Satyavati. And to gain Satyavati's hand, he had to relinquish giving the throne to his own first son, which Shantanu was not ready to do. So instead then, what happened was that he called off the betrothal. However, Devarata found out that his father had decided not to marry Satyavati because of the stipulation of her father that that her sons would be king and not him. So he went to the father and said, I'm willing to set aside being the king and give the throne to your daughter's children. Even if my father isn't, I am. So therefore, he renounced ever being married. And that's where he got the name Bhishma, because he took a terrible oath that he would never marry. And for Kshatriyas, it's unheard of. Usually Kshatriyas have many wives. And he decided not to have, he had a nice round 0 wives. So he decided not to marry at all. And of course, things did not go smoothly, because there was Chitrangada, who ruled for a short time and ruled well, but he was challenged by a Gandharva, and the Gandharva won out. The Gandharva's name was Chitrangada also, and it was like one of those Wild West movies. We're going to find out who the real Chitrangada is here. So they decided that, you know, to fight it out to see who the real Chitrangada was, and the earthly Chitrangada lost to the Gandharva Chitrangada, which moved it over to the second son of Satyavati, who was Vichitravirya. But Vichitravirya was young, and so Vichitravirya was, Bhishmadev arranged for 3 wives for him, the queens of Kashi, Amba, Ambika, and Ambalika. So there's a whole story about Amba, who wanted to marry Shalva, and that didn't happen, and that's a whole tangent in itself. But the other 2 queens, Ambika and Ambalika, they wound up being betrothed to Vichitravirya. However, Vichitravirya died of tuberculosis, so it didn't happen. And there was nobody to be king. So everybody asked Bhishma to be to take the role of king, but he said, I already renounced being the king, so he couldn't do it. But Satyavati said that actually she had another child before her marriage to Shantanu, and that child was, of course, Vyasadeva, the writer of the Vedas. So she called for Vyasadeva, and Vyasadeva then was to get children in the wives of Ambika and Ambalika. So Ambika was the first to meet Vyasadeva, and when she saw Vyasadeva, he was, you know, just out of the forest, and he looked pretty raw, and she was terrified by him, and so she closed her eyes, and then because she closed her eyes, that child was born blind, and that was, of course, Dhritarashtra. Then Vyasadeva came to the second queen, Ambalika, and when she saw him, she turned white with fear. And because she turned white with fear, her child was white, and his name was, of course, Pandu. And then there was the thinking between Satyavati and others that they should have a third child, but neither of the queens wanted to meet Vyasadeva again. So they substituted a maidservant, and therefore when Vyasadeva went to the bedchamber, he came together with the maidservant of the 2 queens, and then that was Vidura. So Vidura was like a sibling of Dhritarashtra. Dhritarashtra could not be king because he was blind. Pandu could be king and was king, but of course we know that Pandu was cursed that when he approached his wife for union in sex, that he would immediately die. And he, at one point, was taken by the urge to approach his wife, Madri, and as a result, he did pass on. So the Pandavas became orphans at that point. All right, so now we know Vidura. Now, as we've been talking about, Vidura was a part of the royal court, but he was not born of one of the queens. So he was given the privileges and status of being in the court, but he was not actually royalty in the full sense. But unlike his brother Dhritarashtra, Vidura was quite spiritually oriented, and he was the great pure one of the group, and he always tried to steer his brother Dhritarashtra on the right course, but generally it didn't work. And as we've been discussing, that at one point he tried to counsel Dhritarashtra, his brother, that the entire problem was Duryodhana, and that Dhritarashtra should curb or set aside Duryodhana. And Duryodhana was in the room, and Duryodhana insulted Vidura, and Vidura took the opportunity to leave, which he went on pilgrimage, and that was for many years. And during that time on pilgrimage, this is where this whole thing starts to cross and recross again. That the Battle of Kurukshetra, of course, took place. It only took 18 days, but it devastated the entire world's population of Kshatriyas. And after the Battle of Kurukshetra, Gandhari was very angry that all of her sons were killed in the Battle of Kurukshetra. And she accused Krishna of having done this. So she said to Krishna that just as you have killed all my children, your dynasty will also be destroyed in the same way. And of course this would be, Krishna didn't object because he had planned to do it anyway. And this would be why, one of the reasons why the Yadu dynasty would be destroyed. The Pandavas only ruled for 36 years. So after the Battle of Kurukshetra, about 36 years later, this curse of Gandhari, of course there was another curse, and that was when Samba and the younger Yadus played a joke on the, sages. They dressed Samba as a lady and pretended that she was pregnant. They put some stuffing there under his belly, and the boys asked, "This lady wants to know whether she'll have a boy or a girl." And the sages didn't take kindly to this kind of trick. And they pronounced a dreadful curse that she will bear a club that will destroy your dynasty. So they looked where the padding had been, and now there was a club, and they were devastated. But they went to the king, to Ugrasena, and they told him what had happened. And Ugrasena felt that he could arrange for the club to be ground into powder so that it would not be a danger, and that's what they did. In this way, Ugrasena thought that he was out of danger by grinding the club into powder. However, there was one shard of it that wouldn't grind, and that was thrown into the waters, and a fish swallowed it. And the other shard, all the powders, that was put in the water too, and somehow or another they grew into canes, very sharp canes that were actually metallic in their consistency. Okay, this will play in later on. So the Yadu dynasty was cursed twice. Once by Gandhari, and the second time by the sages. And 35 years after the Pandavas won the Battle of Kurukshetra and Yudhishthira became king, in Dwarka, ill omens began to manifest, that rats would nibble at the nails and hair of people in the middle of the night, pots would crack for no apparent reason, animals would give birth to other animals of different species, and strange monsters were there, and birds would shriek in fierce and very grating sounds, and in the heavens there was a funny color in the air, and food appeared to get bugs in it for no apparent reasons and things like this. And all these things were not good omens. And Krishna said, well, we have been placed under a curse, so I think this curse now is taking effect and we should all go to Prabhasa Kshetra. So they got on boats and went off Dwarka over to Prabhasa Kshetra. Now, when these ill omens were happening before Krishna actually left for Prabhasa Kshetra, that's when Uddhava shows up in Dwarka, and he could understand that Krishna was intending to wind up the Yadu dynasty. So Uddhava meets Krishna in Dwarka, and he knows that Krishna is planning to remove his dynasty. And he also understands that Krishna himself is planning to leave the world soon. And both of these things are very unpalatable ideas for Uddhava. Uddhava is around the same age as Krishna. And we find out in Bhagavatam that he actually looks quite a bit like Krishna. In fact, at one point, Krishna sent Uddhava sent him to Vrindavan when he could understand that the residents of Vrindavan, especially the gopis, were feeling great separation. So because Uddhava looked like Krishna, Krishna sent a message with Uddhava, and Uddhava arrives in Vrindavan. And when the gopis saw him, they immediately thought, who is this boy that looks just like Krishna? They could tell he wasn't Krishna, but they were immediately beguiled and intrigued by this Uddhava. And of course, that's another tangent, you know. But at any rate, Uddhava, as we find out today, was a disciple of Brihaspati. And he was very learned. But he was very attracted to Krishna, and he begged Krishna to take him with him when he left. He didn't want to stay in the material world after Krishna departs. Krishna did not accept that, and he actually gave Uddhava a whole lot of instructions. In fact, almost the entire 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam is Krishna speaking to Uddhava. So there's this section called the Uddhava Gita, where Krishna is talking and he's explaining, kind of like Krishna explained to Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita, except in this case, he's explaining not to Arjuna, but to Uddhava, the process of spiritual life. And he explains many things. There's a lot. There's the 11th canto has some 31, 32 chapters or something like that. And so there's a lot, from chapter about 6 or 7 all the way up to 31 or 32 is the whole section where Krishna gives Uddhava instructions. And while giving Uddhava all these instructions, then Krishna tells Uddhava that he should not remain long in this material world, but rather he should go to a place of pilgrimage. In particular, Krishna asks Uddhava to go to Badarik Ashram. And the reason Krishna asks Uddhava to go to Badarikashram is because Krishna explains to Uddhava that during his 125 years or so on the earth, he didn't get around to some of the people that he wanted to interact with. You know, he came here, he was supposed to annihilate the demoniac, forces that were assembling on the earth. He did that, and he wanted to establish the Pandavas as rulers. He did that. But he didn't get around to meeting some of the sages that were at Badarika Ashram. So just like he had dispatched Uddhava to the gopis in Vrindavan, he also dispatched Uddhava to the sages at Badarika Ashram. So Uddhava, after hearing Krishna's instructions on devotional service, he leaves. Well, and he starts to head toward Badarika Ashram. But then Krishna makes the arrangement with all the yadus that they go to Prabhasa Kshetra. So Uddhava has left Dwarka, he's on his way to Badarika Ashram, but he learns that Krishna has gone to Prabhasa Kshetra with the yadus. So he decides to double back to meet Krishna at Prabhasa Kshetra. And of course, we know that what happens is that in Prabhasa Kshetra, the yadus, they perform a lot of austerities, and at the end of the austerities, they drink some ritual rice wine, and Satyaki insults Kritavarman because he insults Kritavarma for having helped, what's Dronacharya's son's name again? Ashvatam. He helped Ashvatam kill the sleeping sons of Pandu. So Satyaki insults him while they're a little bit tipsy from having drank this rice wine. And then Kritavarma insults Satyaki for having killed Burashravas while Burashravas was in meditation. What had happened was Burashravas was fighting in the Battle of Kurukshetra, Satyaki, and Burashravas had almost knocked Satyaki unconscious. Satyaki was almost out of it. And Krishna pointed to Arjuna and said, "My dear Arjuna, you better save Satyaki, because looks like in the next minute Burashravas is going to kill Satyaki." So Arjuna shoots off Satyaki's arm as he's about to kill Burashravas. He shoots off Burashravas' arm as he's about to kill Satyaki, that's what I meant to say. He shoots off Burashravas' arm. And Burashravas is angered by that. He said, "I wasn't fighting you, Arjuna, I was fighting Satyaki. You worked out of turn. What is this?" And Arjuna said, "I didn't do anything wrong. This is a war. You shoot who you shoot, So, but Burashravas didn't accept that, and he was very angry. So he sat down and he said, "If this war is going to be fought like this, I'm just going to leave my body through meditation." And as he was meditating, Satyaki comes to consciousness again. And there he sees Burashravas, who he was just having a fight with, and he decides to cut off, Burashravas' head. And everybody says, no, he's meditating, you can't do it. But Satyaki's lost in the heat of war, and he lops off Burashravas' head. And so this was what they were arguing about. This had all happened 36 years before, when the Battle of Kurukshetra had happened. But they brought it up, and so Satyaki insults not Burishravas, but Kritavarman, and Kritavarman insults Satyaki, and then Satyaki explains to Krishna that Kritavarman also had a role in the killing of Satyajit, who was, of course, the father of Satyabhama, who was with Krishna right at that time. So this sets things going, and pretty soon Satyaki takes his sword and kills Burishravas, not Burishravas, but Kritavarman. He kills Kritavarman right there and then. And then the friends of Kritavarman attack Satyaki. And then what are they attacking them with? They don't have anything. They're fighting with plates and bowls because they didn't have their weapons with them. That must have been a kind of a comical battle as they're, trying to win with each other by fighting with eating utensils and stuff like that. And then they discover these canes that are growing in the water, which had been that, club that had been ground by Ugrasena and they'd grown into canes. So they began to grab those, and they attacked each other, and before long, everybody was dead, except for Krishna and Balaram. They were the only two that were left after they fought this fratricidal war on this, after this purification. Of course, Krishna had planned for this to happen this way. And then Balaram emitted a white snake from his mouth and left the material world on the snake and went back to the spiritual world. Krishna did not, but Krishna went under a tree and began to sit down and think after all the residents of the Yadu dynasty had self-annihilated. So Krishna was thinking. While he was thinking, there was a hunter, and the hunter's name was Jara. And the hunter had earlier caught a fish, and in the fish's belly was this one larger piece of the club that wouldn't get ground into powder. And he used that as an arrowhead. And so he shot at what he thought was the face of a deer, but it was actually Krishna's foot. And the arrow only glanced Krishna's foot, but Krishna used it as an excuse to leave the world. So the hunter Jara, when he discovered that he'd actually shot Krishna, he came and he apologized and he asked to be punished for his crime of having shot an arrow at Krishna. And Krishna said, no, I had planned this, and you can come to Vaikuntha with me. So the hunter, and Krishna were soon to depart. But before that episode happened where Krishna departed, that's when Uddhava doubled back and saw Krishna. And as he saw Krishna, Maitreya also arrived. This was just outside of Prabhasa Kshetra, somewhere in the near vicinity. And so Krishna's there, he's just meditating, he hasn't been shot by the hunter yet. And he sees Uddhava, and he'd given Uddhava the instructions to go to Bhadarikashram, but Uddhava wanted to see Krishna one last time. And so there are talks then between Krishna and Uddhava again. Now, they had talked before in Dwarka, but now they're talking somewhere in the vicinity of Prabhasa Kshetra. And during the time of Krishna and Uddhava's talks, Maitreya shows up. And so Maitreya hears this talk back and forth between Uddhava and Krishna. And then Krishna dismisses Uddhava. He goes back on his journey to Bhadarikashram. And Maitreya goes on his journey. He was also on pilgrimage, but he went a different way. So Maitreya goes one way, and Uddhava goes another way. And then Krishna meets the hunter and leaves the world. So Uddhava knows that Krishna has left. Uddhava knows that the Yadu dynasty has self-annihilated. And evidently Vidura also knows this. He came across the news, I'm sure it was big news, and he was in that area. So Vidura then crosses paths with Uddhava, and that's where we are in this part of Bhagavatam. And he asks Uddhava questions about Krishna. He wants to hear about Krishna. And in the next chapter, in Canto 3, Chapter 2, we will hear that Vidura asks Uddhava questions. But Vidura begins to think about Krishna and goes into samadhi. And that we'll learn about in the next chapter. But eventually, Uddhava will decline to give Vidura lessons or instructions, and instead take him or point him towards Maitreya, who is not so far away yet. And since Maitreya has just heard this same, instruction and kata that Uddhava and Krishna have just undergone between each other, then this is why Vidura will hear from Maitreya. So it's really sort of intricate the way all this works together. But I'll kind of put the bookmark there, and I'll ask if any of you have questions or if any of this is still kind of scrambled in the timeline. So basically, we have Vidura leaving before the Battle of Kurukshetra because Duryodhana insulted him. Then we have the Battle of Kurukshetra being fought. And then we have the Pandavas winning and the Yadu dynasty being cursed. And then 36 years later, we have the curse coming to fruition. And that's when Uddhava meets Krishna again. And he gets some instructions. And he's sent to Badarik Ashram. Then Krishna with the Yadus go to Prabhasa Kshetra. And there at Prabhasa Kshetra, the Yadu dynasty self-annihilates. Uddhava doubles back and meets Krishna again at Prabhasa Kshetra vicinity. And Maitreya shows up at that time. And then Krishna leaves the world, and Maitreya and Uddhava go their separate ways. But Uddhava crosses Vidura's path, and Vidura now is asking questions of Uddhava, and eventually Uddhava will send him to Maitreya. Okay, so.
That's the third canto.
What's that? It's splattered out.
I mean the Maitreya and Vidura and Uddhava.
Yeah, we'll hear how even in this chapter we're going to hear a little bit about how Vidura gets pointed over to Maitreya by Uddhava, but it gets a little bit more elaborate in the next chapter. And then a lot of this is also in the 11th canto too. So there's a lot of different places where this comes from. And some of it's in the Mahabharata, so you've got all these different sources where the timeline is there. But
it's not chronological in the cantos.
No, it's not chronological in the cantos. We, go back and forth. We're talking about, Ram in 9th canto. We're talking about Ramachandra, which is, in Treta Yuga, which is a long time ago. And then we have, the whole story of Varahadev, which is, which is like in the very beginning as Brahma creates the universe, So All these things just bounce back and forth. And Prabhupada tells us that, as even the purports say, that the Bhagavatam is not chronological, it's thematic. So they follow themes and not necessarily a special timeline. That used to confuse me, but I think actually when talking about philosophy, it's better to follow themes than timelines, because otherwise you can't really develop a philosophical point if you're trying to be chronological, because there's all this cause and effect, and the entire chronology of various kings up to Shantanu, then the Pandavas, and then after the Pandavas, Parikshit, and then Janmajaya. All this is a huge space of time. So, and of course, the Bhagavatam goes way beyond that. We hear about Kali Yuga, and we hear about Kapila Dev at the end of Kali Yuga, and we go way back to Varaha Dev, and all that kind of thing. So there's huge quantities of time. So trying to keep a chronology would be kind of ridiculous in Srimad Bhagavatam.
When Vidura was talking, he wanted to mostly speak with Uddhava, right? But then Uddhava kind of makes him speak to Maitreya.
Right.
Uddhava feels a little embarrassed that
Yeah.
Still more.
Because Uddhava is the same age as Krishna and Vidura. Almost more than before. And that's talks about what is it, the offense of Mayada Vriyatikara, of giving instruction when someone is more qualified. I think in many cases it's it's kind of a social construct, because we learn actually that Maitreya is kind of almost an impersonalist, and Uddhava is a pure devotee, because Uddhava is going into ecstasy, so Uddhava would certainly be better to teach Vidura, but nevertheless this is how it plays out, that Uddhava passes off the role of teacher to Maitreya, because Maitreya is in the same age category. Yeah.
Just a pre-question before another question. Would the other dynasty or Krishna's dynasty that all killed themselves, would they be considered devotees?
Yes, more or less.
So Krishna would consider them part of his own devotees?
Yeah, I think that in general they were devotees, and you get this sense that Krishna's entourage is a mix. You have devotees, you have demigods, you have sages from the past, all kinds of, different people from different categories, all, kind of assembling to play a role in Krishna's pastimes. And then each of them go back to their various places, like we were talking about the other day with Yamaraj, when Yamaraj had, replied to Mandavya Rishi that he had him impaled for the karma of piercing an ant with a straw, then Mandavya Rishi cursed Yamaraj to take birth as Vidura. So when, just like any other job, if Yamaraj has to go onto the earth and take the role of Vidura, somebody's got to do it. So our Yama is substituting. They get a substitute, a Yamaraj substitute, just like a substitute teacher or something like that. So he's officiating the post of Yamaraj while Yamaraj is actually down here on the earth acting as the role of Vidura. Yeah, something like that. What's that? Aryama. Whoever Aryama is, I don't know much about him.
So Maharaj, yeah, so if that's the case, that his dynasty is considered devotees, and he was, Krishna was so focused on making sure that someone, when he was instructing Arjuna to act in the proper way and not renounce his position as warrior, because he said for a Kshatriya or for someone in a position, there's nothing worse than having that bad reputation afterwards. Why did he allow his own dynasty to sort of meet their demise in such in like an embarrassing way? And like, if they're considered his devotees, like, why did he choose to allow his own dynasty to sort of be remembered forever as people who just sort of squabbled and fought and ended up killing each other?
Yeah, right. Or why did he allow himself to get shot in the foot with it? I mean,
Yeah,
it
was a not very honourable way to leave. Like, why did he choose to do it in that way? Because he was so focused with speaking to Arjuna that making sure that he was remembered as somebody that was great, and he said, you know, how great people act is that common men follow. So why did he allow his dynasty to be represented in such a strange way?
Yeah, right. Well, I have a direct and immediate answer for that. There's a lot of things Krishna does that I think no one will ever figure out. And who knows, you know, when you read a lot of the Mahabharata and I'm always finding these questions that somebody asks, and then suddenly there it'll be somewhere, and someone will actually be written there, you know, and in the Bhagavatam or the Mahabharata, where we say, oh, the reason is happening. You know, but so far I haven't run across it. But I would say in general that, you know, in one sense, Krishna is trying to get across through our thick heads that this material world is not a nice place, and that there's accidents even on the royal road, that even if you're in Krishna's own family, you know, like in Vaidacharya, he had 6 sons and 3 of them were Mayavadis or something like that. So
he's sort of saying that even if you're in my own dynasty, it's not safe to try and enjoy the material.
Right.
Because you can still like meet your demise in that.
Right, right. That even, you know, on the royal roads or even being part of the entourage doesn't mean that the material world isn't going to do its usual business some way or another.
Because obviously that the fortune of that person who was born as, I forgot his name, the one who pretended that he was pregnant.
Oh, Samba.
Samba, yeah. So like his fortune for being being born in, so amazingly fortunate, and what karma he must like to be born into Krishna's life.
Right,
At
right.
the time of Krishna's arrival on the earth. But now he's like forever remembered as this sort of embarrassing son that sort of like got
Right,
obsessed and
right.
so strange, you know?
Yeah, right, right. So Krishna is an interesting screenwriter. He has some interesting twists and turns. You never can guess what's going to happen next, and I think that's part of it. You know, that he is not going to write a dull or an unimaginative plot. You know, there's going to be a lot of weird twists and turns, and with his devotees, they will somehow come out of it. Yeah, Chandra. It was spoken in Dwarka, so that whole 11th canto takes place in Dwarka. Yeah, that conversation is, I forget where that one is, you know, but it's a different conversation. That's the one that Maitreya was able to eavesdrop on because he was there. Yeah.
Is this all, this Maitreya and Vidura Samba, this conversation, is it all encapsulated in Narada Muni and Brahma's conversation?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Shukadeva Goswami and Parikshit's?
That's kind of the indication I get. It's like a dream within a dream within a dream, because when somebody explains something, you know, you have first Vyasadeva speaking, then you have the sages at Naimisharanya. And so you've got, say, Shamak Rishi saying, "My dear Sutta Goswami, please tell us about spiritual life." He goes, "You have asked a wonderful question, and I'm reminded of when Parikshit was speaking to Sukadeva Goswami. And what did Parikshit say what did Sukadeva Goswami say to Parikshit? Well, he said, and then the parentheses opens up again, and Sukadeva Goswami said, "You've asked a very wonderful question. Actually, let us talk about what was being said by Maitreya to Uddhava." So it's like doom, doom, doom. It's kind of like that, I think it is, you know, sort of like a conversation within a conversation within a conversation. So you get that too. We see that kind of in the first canto we have a lot of Sutta Goswami and the sages at Naimisharanya and Sukadeva and Parikshit. But then we kind of get into Maitreya and Uddhava for a big piece of time then. So I haven't actually followed that thread to find out how much that goes through Bhagavatam, you know, but it works kind of like that.
I was also wondering one thing that you were saying that Yamaraj comes as Vidura, but we also understand Yamaraj comes as Yudhishthira as well.
Right.
So how does that work?
Yeah. This is one of those mysterious things that somehow or another one entity can become two or more even in the material world. How that works, I don't know. But as we said the other day, you know, when Vidura preaches to Dhritarashtra, and Dhritarashtra finally emulates his body, and Gandhari goes into the fire. Shortly after that, Vidura begins to fast, and that's when Yudhishthira comes upon Vidura. And when Yudhishthira comes upon Vidura, Yudhishthira asks Vidura to bless him, and Vidura doesn't respond. And he's got, you know, he's apparently in samadhi, but actually it becomes obvious that he's leaving his body. And in some accounts it says that the spirit of Vidura entered into Yudhishthira. Yeah, yeah. At least one account I read was like that. So it's kind of similar to, you know, you have Lord Chaitanya and his brother Nityananda, and you have, you know, Nityananda, and at the same time you have Lord Chaitanya's brother, was it Vishvarup, yeah, so Vishvarup. They're both expansions of Balaram, and it said that when Vishvarup disappeared, he merged into Nityananda, so something like that. But there's a number of cases like that. I can't explain it exactly, but I've run across that at least in 3 or 4 or 5 cases where apparently one entity is 2 or maybe even sometimes more in the material world, and then they amalgamate again or something like that. How that works, I don't know. But all right, so anyway, thank you very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.